Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Christian Miller. He is the AC Reid Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University, and today we're going to talk about his latest book, Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. And there it is. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for coming on the show again, and thank you so much for the book.
It's wonderful to see you again. It was a great conversation last time, and I'm sure it will be again this time.
Yeah. So let's start perhaps with something that is not directly related to honesty, but what makes something a virtue?
So I think of honesty as a virtue, one of the virtues, and virtues in general are character traits. So let's start there. So a virtue is part of your character. If you have a virtue, it's a character trait. So it's a disposition of your mind. It's part of your mind. It disposes you to think, feel, and act certain ways. So it has a thinking component, it has a feeling and a motivational component, and then those two together give rise to outward behavior. So to not talk about honesty, let me give another example, because we'll obviously spend a lot of time on honesty. Take something like compassion. A virtue of compassion means, if you're a virtuously compassionate person, that means you are disposed to think in compassionate ways. So you think about helping other people, you recognize their needs, you think it's important to help them, you're motivated to feel compassionate feelings towards them. So you want to help them selflessly for the right reasons. And those thoughts and feelings together combine to give rise to actual helping behavior. So it's a character trait with those components to it, but it's also got to be not just any character trait, because after all, there are vices too. So it has to be a virtue, it has to be an excellence of character. It has to be oriented in the right way. So the thoughts have to be correct thoughts. The feelings have to be virtuous feelings. Towards things that really matter, that oriented towards things that really matter, and the behavior has to be correct behavior, has to be good behavior. So all those things combined, and probably more too, but make up how I think a moral virtue works.
Mm-hmm. And how would you define honesty?
Honesty itself, I would say, let's be careful what we're going to focus on. We could focus on honest behavior. So I tell you the truth right now, I'm doing something honest. But since we're going to be thinking about this in a broader perspective of honest person and a virtue and a character trait, then we want to use the same kind of framework. We want to think, okay, honesty it's first of all, it's a character trait. It's part of your mind. It disposes you to think a certain way. So it has a thought component. It has a feeling component. It has a behavioral component too. Now, can we go beyond that and say something specific about honesty? Well, I think we can, but we'd have to unpack each of those components. So how about we start with the behavioral side of it, and we can go to the others too if there's time.
Okay.
So what does honesty look like as far as an honest person behaving in the world? Well, I think the first thing to note here is that honesty pertains to a lot of morality. It covers a lot of moral ground. It's surprisingly broad in scope. So it pertains to lying. Of course, it doesn't support lying, but it has to do with lying. But not just that. Everyone thinks of lying, first of all, but not just that. Also, misleading other people, cheating other people, breaking promises, stealing, BSing or bullshitting, hypocrisy. The list is long, and we can dive into specific ones if you like as well later on. So it covers a lot of territory. And then we ask the question, well, what is it about all of those areas of morality that they have in common that honesty pertains to, that honesty speaks to, that honesty has to do with? Mm-hmm. And to cut to the chase and give you a direct answer, I think honesty at its core, honesty behavior in particular at its core, has to do with not intentionally distorting the facts as you see them. That's a mouthful, and let me unpack it some. So an honest person does not, on purpose, intentionally, misrepresent reality as they see it to themselves or others. So if I lie to you, I'm distorting the facts. I'm misrepresenting how I see things in my communication with you. If I mislead you, I'm doing the same thing. If I steal, cheat, and lie, I think I'm doing the same thing as well. So to wrap it up then, at its core, honesty is ultimately a matter of not doing that, not behaving in that kind of way where you are distorting or misrepresenting how you see the world in your interactions with yourself, because you can be dishonest to yourself, and most importantly, perhaps your interactions with other people and the ways in which you can be dishonest with other people. So that was a lot there. We can go in lots of different directions from that, but that's how I see it.
Yes, I want to get into some of the behaviors that are incompatible with honesty that you explore in the book, and also some of the psychological literature associated with them. But before that, in the book, you also talk about some narrower virtues associated with honesty. So what are these, and how do you look at the relationship that they have with honesty?
Yep, good. So just like I was talking about, there are these different areas of morality that honesty pertains to. So take lying. Well, if you just look at lying by itself, a liar is going to have the vice of being a liar. Corresponding to that, you might say there's a virtue of being truthful. A truthful person is not inclined to lie, but rather in communication accurately presents how the person sees the world. So there's a virtue right there, truthfulness. That's the one that has to do with lying. Well, we said that there are lots of other ways of failing to be honest as well. You can be misleading, you can be a thief, you can be a cheater, and so forth. And so for each of those ways of failing to be honest, there's a corresponding virtue. So truthfulness for lying, forthrightness as opposed to misleading other people, proper respect for property as opposed to being a thief, and so forth. And so for each of these areas, there's a vice and a virtue. And well, how does that relate to honesty? Well, in order to be honest, you've got to have all those bases covered. In other words, in order to be honest, you better be truthful, you better be forthright, you better have proper respect for other people's property, and so forth. If you fail in one of those areas, you can't be an honest person. So the virtue of honesty depends upon being well disposed, having a good character in these other areas too, such that all of them are necessary. You gotta check the box on all of them. And if you fail at just one of them, sadly, you can't be an honest person. You can still be great in many respects, but to be honest, you got to check the box on all these different areas, and that's how they're related.
So let me ask you this: when there's a situation where there's a virtue like honesty placed on the table, and I mean, you can decide if you're going to tell the truth or not, but there are other moral values in question, and for example, if there's the option of lying to protect the life of another person, I mean, is it that if you do that, you're being dishonest, and if so, you're being immoral? Or I mean, how does it work exactly when there's a conflict between a virtue in this case and some other moral values that might be placed above or below that virtue?
Sure. It's a great question. To make it more concrete, let's take an actual example and work through the example. The most famous example here, and many of your listeners will know it already, is the Nazi at the door example. Mm-hmm. This is an example that actually stems from Kant, who was before Nazi Germany. He had a version of this where it was an axe murderer who was going through a neighborhood looking for someone, an innocent person. But the example has been updated, so now it's you're hiding. Suppose that you're in a house during an occupied town during World War II, and you're hiding a Jewish family in the basement, and the Nazis are doing a routine patrol of the neighborhood, going door to door, just asking the same question every time. Do you know where any Jews are? They don't suspect you. They have no reason to think you're hiding anyone. So they knock on the door, you open the door, and they say, do you know where any Jews are? Well, here's your scenario in an actual concrete situation. You could tell the truth and say, yes, I do know where Jews are. They're in the basement, in which case the Nazis are going to come in, kill the Jews, and you probably get in trouble as well. Or you could lie and say, no, I don't know where any Jews are, and then they'll close the door and move on to the next house, and you'll have saved the lives of that family. Well, when you ask people what's the right thing to do, overwhelmingly they say the right thing to do is to lie. That's pretty uncontroversial these days. Now, how does that factor into honesty? And now speaking to your question, you could go a couple of different ways. I'll give you two options that I don't hold, and then I'll give you the option I do hold.
Okay.
So two options. Here's one option I don't hold. You could say that the answer, I don't know where any Jews are, does not count as lying because the Nazi has no right to the truth in the first place. And I can only lie to people who have the right to the truth. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a plausible position. I think it's clear that I would be lying to the Nazi if I said I don't know where any Jews are. Another very clever response is to say, this: I don't know where any Jews are is actually telling the truth. Why? Because I'm using Jews in a very specific way that the Nazis are also using the expression Jews to mean subhuman animals, not persons, disgusting, etc. That's what the Nazis mean by Jews. They hate Jews, and so they think of them that way. And I'm just parroting that back. I'm just repeating that back to them, and I say, I don't know where any Jews are. And that's true. Mm-hmm. Because I don't know where any subhuman creatures, animals are, understood that way. I know where some people are in the basement, but I don't know where any Jews are defined in this degrading manner. That's another thing you could say. I don't think that's very plausible to say either. So now, to make a long story short, or I don't know, maybe it'll continue to be a long story. Here's what I would say. If I answered, I don't know where any Jews are, I'm lying. Lying is incompatible with honesty. Mm-hmm. And that's a particular instance of lying behavior. It's a dishonest behavior. It's intentionally distorting the facts as I see them, like I defined it earlier. So I fail to count as honest in this particular instance. Doesn't make me a dishonest person in general. Character is different from one particular behavior, but in this instance, I fail to count as honest. However, other values are in play, like you said. Compassion, for example, is in play. Respect for the dignity of human beings is in play. And so other virtues also get into play. And now we have here's the direct answer. We have a conflict between competing virtues. We have honesty on the one hand, compassion on the other hand. They're coming into conflict with each other. Which one's more important? Well, they have to be assessed in this situation. Sometimes in other situations, honesty is more important than compassion. Sometimes compassion is more important than honesty. We need to assess it in this situation. And in this situation, compassion is more important than honesty. So the upshot is that you end up doing something morally correct in lying. So the morally obligatory, the morally required thing to do is to lie. It might seem odd and paradoxical, but it's actually the way I think we should understand the case.
Yes, because here, when we're talking about honesty, is it simply a moral virtue, or does it encompass other philosophical aspects and not just ethics or morality?
Um, so that's a big question. So as far as this particular example is concerned, I think we're just going to talk about the moral virtue of honesty, and I think it conflicts with other moral virtues like compassion. And morally speaking, we'll just keep it all moral. Morally speaking, the right thing to do is to be dishonest. Leaving aside the example, though, as a more general question, how does is honesty just limited to morality, or can honesty be understood as ranging broader than morality? I think the answer there is there are different kinds of normativity. There's different norms, different kinds of norms. Good and bad, right and wrong are not just limited to the moral. There's good and bad when it comes to art. There's good and bad when it comes to our thinking. There's good and bad when it comes to religion and so forth. So there are different areas of life where we can bring in the ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, and virtue and vice. And so now, speaking to honesty specifically, there can be moral honesty, but there can also be intellectual honesty. Honesty that pertains to your thinking and your investigation of the world. And maybe there are other types beyond that too. But I think, yeah, the short answer, which I have trouble giving short answers, is that there's more to honesty than just moral honesty.
So, what makes someone an honest person? Earlier, for example, you said that there's a clear distinction between character and failing in a particular situation. I mean, it's just not that one strike and you're out here. But I mean, how do you say that someone is honest? Does it have something to do with just some psychological traits, with behavioral tendencies that the person has? Does it have to do with statistics? I mean, do we have to account for the number of times the person is dishonest or honest? Or, I mean, how does it go?
Yeah. I don't have a clear answer to this. It's a great question. And I don't think there's going to be any kind of rigid mathematical answer. So, we're a neat little checklist that we could just use and get an answer to. We could take a particular subject and run them through the checklist and okay, honest, we're done. So it's going to have multiple parts to it. So, objectively, is there psychology a certain way? Is there psychology involving honest thoughts? Is it involving honest feelings? Is that manifesting outwardly in honest behavior? So we've already said that, but now let's say some more. If that behavior and those thoughts and feelings had better have two additional features to them. One is stability over time. So you don't get to count as honest just because you're honest one time, like you said, or one day or 1 week. You better have a stable pattern to your thinking, feeling, and behavior over time. But that's not enough either, because you could have that stable pattern just in the courtroom. Like every time you go to the courtroom, you're stably honest, but nowhere else. That would be bizarre. Maybe you could say you're honest, you have the virtue of honesty in the courtroom. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about honesty, period. So to be honest, period, you better be honest across situations that are relevant to honesty, which frankly are most situations in life. Most situations in life are going to be ones where issues of honesty can arise. So it better be, at home, at the office, at the party, at the courtroom, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how much consistency and stability? That's where it gets fuzzy. So we already said, look, if I fail, if I, happen to slip up at the party and tell a lie, that doesn't automatically disqualify me. But on the other extreme, it seems clear that every time I go to the party, I tell lots of lies. That does seem like it disqualifies me. Well, where do you draw the line in the middle? That's where it gets fuzzy. I mean, it does seem like, to be honest, you better, for the most part, tell the truth, not cheat, not steal, do all those things. But if you want me to give you a percentage, 75% of the time, as opposed to 74% of the time, character doesn't work that way. It's not specific to honesty. No character trait is going to be susceptible to that kind of minutia of mathematical, specificity. That kind of fine-grained analysis.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the psychological traits that are associated with honesty and predispose a particular person to being honest, does it matter to what extent the person has control over them? So let's say, for example, that through psychological studies, we get to know that all of them have some innateness to them. So the person doesn't really choose to have them. She's just sort of born with the tendency to being honest. I mean, does that matter?
It can matter in some ways and not matter in other ways. So Aristotle had an idea of natural virtue and then kind of genuine virtue. So Aristotle was already kind of clued into this idea that maybe some people already have an advantage, that they are maybe more, like you said, predisposed in a certain direction. This is for all character traits. You could ask the same question about any character trait. So that person is kind of already farther along, already has something of an advantage. However, Aristotle thought that would not give you a genuine character. To have a genuine character, maybe we'll say here just like a genuinely moral character, later in life, you have to become involved yourself in terms of making choices and acting on those choices and having some free will and control and responsibility for your own character. So what difference does it make, or how does it matter? It does seem like it matters in that if you're predisposed a certain way, you have a head start. It also seems like it matters in the sense that you don't deserve credit for that. You should not be morally praised, or if you don't have that head start, blamed based upon factors that are beyond your control, that you were just born with or genetically acquired. Similarly, you're not praised or blamed for your eye color or your height or things like this. But another way it matters is that you have a head start, so you're probably more likely to be honest, or at least more likely to exhibit honest behavior than other people are. So that's another way in which it matters. Yeah, I mean, so there are several ways to answer this question. But I think the key one, though, if I'm giving you a simple answer, is that for matters of praise and blame and responsibility, you're not going to get credit for that head start that you get. Mm-hmm. That's the straightforward answer.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to attributing responsibility for people's actions, I mean, to what extent would you consider contextual factors? And perhaps we'll get more into this when we get into the psychological literature on some of the behaviors that run counter to honesty. But I mean, if people find themselves in particular contexts that we know induce behaviors that are not compatible with honesty, I mean, to what extent does that matter?
Oh, yeah, I think it matters a great deal. We have to get into particular cases, though, and we have to know what those contextual factors are. Are they operating at the level of the unconscious? So do you even recognize that those contextual factors are there or not? if they're operating at the conscious level of conscious awareness, how powerful are they? Are they more just nudges or influences as opposed to basically overpowering the person? It's one thing to, incentivize someone to be honest with some rewards in the environment. It's another thing to, metaphorically hold a gun to their head and say you have to behave this way or there are going to be dire consequences. This is the kind of evasive philosophy answer, where we kind of make distinctions and we look at different kind of cases and we have to go case by case. But as a general matter, no doubt about it, the situation and environment you are in is going to bear on your responsibility, to the point where in some situations you can be absolved of responsibility completely for telling a lie, for example, because the factors in the situation were so overpowering that, for example, maybe you had no choice, or no reasonable person could have told the truth in that kind of situation. So yes, it definitely matters.
Mm-hmm. But even in the cases where you get to be completely absolved of responsibility, does that necessarily make you an honest person if you lie, for example? Because I mean, it could be the difference between not being dishonest and being honest, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. So in this kind of case, so let me make sure I got the case right. So you're absolved of responsibility for lying. In the particular case, you tell a lie, and there's a question of, are you just failing to be honest, or are you actually dishonest?
Yes. Are you a virtuous person when it comes to honesty, or not really?
Or so to be virtuous, then you would have to flip the case around. So it would be a case where you have no control and you're kind of forced to tell the truth. And then we've got honesty. But the points will apply the same way. So let's go with the way it's initially set up. So under tremendous pressure, or maybe through some kind of brain manipulation or whatnot, you tell a lie. You're absolved of responsibility. We'll just stipulate that. You're not blameworthy for telling that lie. It was out of your control. Then that's quite a nice point. Is that a failure of honesty, or is that being dishonest? And those are two different things. And it's clearly a failure of honesty at the very least. Now, what do we mean when we say it's dishonest? If it means dishonest means it stems from or arises from the vice of dishonesty. So it's dishonest because it was produced by the vice of dishonesty, then I would say not necessarily, probably not. Maybe the person isn't even dishonest in the first place. Doesn't even have that vice. If we're just thinking about this as a particular behavior in and of itself, well, what is a dishonest behavior? Well, I think an honest behavior is not intentionally distorting the facts as you see them. So a dishonest behavior is intentionally distorting the facts as you see them. So you are distorting the facts as you see them. Now, they said intentionally that might come into play here. Are you doing it as the result of your own agency? Are you doing it on purpose as a result of your own values and so forth? And it looks like in this example, maybe not. Maybe this is not an intentionally distorting the facts. And if that's not the case, then it's not dishonest. So it's a failure of honesty, but we'd have to sort out whether it's a intentional distortion of the facts. Sorry if this is getting way in the weeds and getting way abstract, but it will matter whether it's an expression of your own agency or whether it's something more accidental that's happening outside of your control. And if it's more accidental then it's not a dishonest action.
Mhm.
Okay.
So when it comes to intentionality specifically, let's
Mhm.
say that someone in a particular case communicates information that is false, not intentionally, but because the person is uninformed. I mean, in that case, is there any responsibility for the person to bear because she should be better informed or not, or does
Yeah.
it depend?
Yeah, of course it's going to depend. Yep. On the reasons why the person's not informed. So there's a question about responsibility here. There's also a question about honesty. So let's take two cases. Let's take a case of someone who was alive 5,000 years ago,
Mhm.
and that person is in a conversation about the shape of the Earth, and that person says uh, the Earth is flat. Well, in a sense, they're uninformed because they don't know the truth. They don't know the objective truth, which is that the Earth is round. Um, but their being uninformed is completely reasonable. It makes sense. We would not blame them for being uninformed. They had no way of knowing any better. And I think in that case, they are not blameworthy and also honest. They're being honest when they say the Earth is flat, even though they're saying something that's false.
Mhm.
So this is, I think, a really interesting feature of honesty, which is that honesty doesn't track the truth. Honesty tracks how you see the world, the subjective truth. Uh, so that person, I think, can be completely honest. Now, let's update it today. Well, you can get a version of that case as well today of someone who's raised in a very isolated community without much contact with the world, no internet access, and so forth. And they're raised to believe that the Earth is flat, and that's the only thing they've ever heard. And they're asked, what's the shape of the Earth, even today? And they say the Earth is flat. I think they're still being honest. And I would not say that they're blameworthy. But now the third case is going to be someone who, is raised in a more familiar setting today, goes to a familiar school system, et cetera, and through willful ignorance or self-deception or some other means, blocks the evidence and ignores it that the Earth is round, and instead, for whatever reason, wants to believe that the Earth is flat. Well, in that case, I think there's a failure of intellectual honesty here. They are distorting the facts as the evidence is presented to them, um, and as they clearly see the evidence to be. And so there, I think they are blameworthy, yes, and also dishonest. So both of those can happen, blameworthy and dishonest, with respect to evidence that the person should have been more responsive to, had available, did not respond to in the right way, and so failed.
Mhm. So when it comes, for example, to promise breaking, I guess that there are several complications in several different contexts. So, for example, it might be the case that someone makes a promise in a particular point in time, but when it comes the time to really deliver on it, I mean, the circumstances have changed and she can't do it. I mean, something along those lines. If
Yep,
that happens, is the person dishonest?
yep. Um, so this is, promise keeping is the one I've had the most pushback about, I would say. So when I say that honesty pertains to lots of different things, and I start going through the list, people hesitate the most about the promise keeping. Now, promise making, that's clearly something that honesty has to do with. If you uh, falsely make a promise with no intention of keeping it,
Mhm.
then you're being dishonest, and that's pretty cut and dry. However, what about promise keeping? And especially, you've got a nuanced, more interesting case of what if things have changed since you made the original promise.
Mhm.
Um, so first of all, I'm willing to acknowledge that maybe promise keeping doesn't have to do with honesty. We can have that fight if you want, and I might give that up. But let's suppose it does. In your scenario, let's make an example like that. Let's say you make a promise to help your okay. I made a promise to help my kids with the homework. And I made this promise to them a day in advance. So I know you got a lot of homework coming up. I promise I'll help you tomorrow with your homework. And it was a genuine promise. It was sincere. I'm not, faking it. Tomorrow comes along. My kids ask me, "Can you help with my homework?" And I say, "Well, at this point, I'm just really tired, and I don't feel like it anymore. And I'd rather just sit on the couch and watch TV." Well, that to me seems like that's no good. You're still bound by the promise you made. If you fail to uphold the promise, for those kinds of reasons, you're not let off the hook. It would be morally wrong, and it would also be dishonest. But here's a different scenario. I made a promise to help my kids with the homework. I'm driving home. The next day, I'm driving home from work and fully intending to help them with the homework. Along the way home, there's an accident, a car accident. And no one else is around. It's a single driver who's run into a pole or something like that, seriously injured, cannot call for the ambulance. I have a choice now. Do I keep driving and keep my promise, or do I stop and help the driver? Well, it seems clear what the right thing to do is. I should stop and help the driver, and I do so. And then later on, eventually hours later, I come home. My kids are asleep or they're about to go to sleep. They say, "You promised us." And I say to them, "I did, but something else came along." And in this kind of case, we're back to competing virtues. We've got another competing virtue situation where honesty is now competing with another virtue, say compassion once again, and it gets trumped by that competing virtue. It's an interesting question at this point whether I'm still being dishonest. And I haven't thought through this completely, but you might say I was dishonest, but it gets outweighed by the importance of helping the driver. Or you might say, no, the promise has implicit in it some exceptions. So I promise to help you with your homework. And I don't say this, but implicit in that is unless something very significant, much more significant, comes along, in which case the promise dissolves, like saving the life of an innocent person, in which case the promise, I'm not held to the promise anymore. So you could say that I'm actually not being dishonest at all because the promise goes away. Or you could say, no, the promise still holds, but it's outweighed by more important values, in which case I'm dishonest, but no big deal because something more important was at stake.
So before we get into the psychological aspects of honesty and the literature, let me just ask you one more thing that I think people would want to know about. Earlier we talked about lying, but what about omitting information? So let's say that I don't lie, but I just don't answer a particular question or omit a particular piece of information. Is that problematic?
Yeah, it's certainly problematic in general. And so that I think is clear. Well, I'm a philosopher, so I should slow down, and we should say it depends on the case, and it depends on the situation, and we always got to be careful about what we're talking about. Maybe sometimes it's good to omit the information, and oversharing is not a good thing either. So let me go a little slower. It depends on the situation. Here's a case where it's fine to omit things. If you're having just a casual conversation with someone you don't know very well, and a person asks how your day is going, and you've had a big tragedy earlier in the day, I think it's fine to omit that, not share that. if you know, it's fine to not share how many times you went to the bathroom, or it's fine to not share how much money you have in your bank account, those kind of things. That's oversharing. That's sometimes called being too honest, although I think it's actually a failure of something else like discretion or tact or some kind of, you know, practical wisdom there. However, the cases you're thinking of, I think, are different than that. You're thinking of case situations in which someone's asking you for a very specific thing, in which they're entitled to know that thing. It's perfectly reasonable for them to ask about this information, and you dodge it. You kind of try to steer them in another direction. You answer with silence. You walk away, or you give a truthful, partial answer that leaves out some crucial information. All those things are dishonest. I think in normal cases of that, they're dishonest. So, a couple of examples. If you know the U.S. News college rankings, if a university leaves out some crucial information when they're submitting their information to the U.S. News for the college rankings, that's dishonest. If you're applying for a job and you leave out some important relevant information in your resume that would hurt your chances of getting the job, that's dishonest. If your wife or husband or whatever asks you, where were you last night after you went to the bar, and you say, I came home, which is true, you did come home eventually, but you leave out the period of time when you were doing some things you weren't supposed to do with another woman or man, that's dishonest. These are intentional omissions of relevant and important information in those situations. Why are they dishonest? Well, because they're intentionally distorting the facts. Go back to my theory again. On purpose, you're intentionally misrepresenting to another person what happened as you see it. You're distorting reality in your communication with them with the goal of trying to get them to believe something that did not actually happen. And that's got to be dishonest.
But are there particular cases where you would agree that we can say that someone is being too honest or not, and we would say that perhaps they are failing to respect some other virtue?
Yeah.
Simply.
So this is a controversial matter. My postdoc who works with me here at Wake Forest, he and I disagree about this. He's actually written a paper arguing that I'm wrong. So we kind of go back and forth on this. This is tied up to a larger question of what the vices are with honesty. So let me talk about that for a moment, and then specifically about your question. Aristotle held the view that for any virtue, there's at least two vices. There's a vice of deficiency, where you don't have enough of the virtue, and a vice of excess, where you have too much of the virtue. So for the easy example is courage. If you have too little, you're a coward. If you have too much, you're rash or foolish or bold, too bold. For honesty, there's clearly a vice of deficiency. That's dishonesty. You don't have enough honesty. That's clear. I'm not convinced that there is a vice of excess, though. I'm not convinced that there really is something called too much honesty. The vice, being too honest. We talk that way. I acknowledge that, and there's something to this when you have examples of oversharing. You can say you're being too honest. You're sharing too much information with another person. So if, again, like what I was talking about a few minutes ago, if, like in our conversation right now, I start rattling off my bank account and my bathroom habits and what I ate for breakfast and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and I say all of that truthfully, I'm not distorting anything. I'm not lying to you misleading you in any way about any of it. Still, I'm doing something inappropriate. My inclination, though, is to say I'm not failing with respect to honesty. After all, I'm being completely sincere and authentic and forthcoming to you. So it's hard to see how I'm falling short there with honesty. I'm falling short instead with some other virtue, like you alluded to. I'm not moderating my honesty or balancing my honesty appropriately given the situation. And so I'm failing at things called like discretion or tact, or being careful in my speech to only share what's appropriate to the situation. So that's how I would understand it.
Mhm. So let's get into the psychological literature then. Of course, we won't have time to explore every single psychological study out there, but what are the ones that you would like to highlight and perhaps you think tell more about honesty?
Yeah, good. So we could go back to those different categories like lying and cheating and stealing and promise breaking and so forth. And it turns out that there's more empirical literature for some of them than others. And not surprising, maybe like stealing, not surprising that there's not a lot of behavioral studies of that. It's hard to construct psychology experiments to test stealing. You could, of course, ask for self-reports. You can ask people to verbally tell you how many times have you stolen in your life or in the last year or not. But not surprising, again, that may not be the most reliable information. People might not be too forthcoming about that. So some areas we don't know much, and we should be upfront about that. Where we have, I think, the most promising or the richest amount of empirical literature has to do with cheating. So I'll focus on that. And there are different setups that are used to probe people's cheating. There are different types of experiments, and I'll mention briefly a couple types and then hone in on one and dive a little bit deeper into one. So there are experiments that, for example, ask people to roll a dice privately and then tell you what you got. And there would be a reward for a higher dice roll. And so you can see, on average, are people likely telling you what they got, or are they inflating numbers? You can also do this with coin flips. Like you'll get $1 if you flip heads, and you won't get any money if you flip tails. And then ask people to do that privately and see what they say. A little bit more sophisticated is a type of study that I like a lot, where students, it's normally students, but it doesn't have to be, will come into the lab. They'll be given a test, say 20 problems. They'll be told, we'll pay you for every correct answer you get. So for, let's say 50 cents is one common US dollars, 50 cents for each correct answer. So the people take the test. And then when they're done, they turn it in and they get paid based upon their performance. Cut and dry. So if you got 10 right, you get paid $5. Now, that's not so interesting, but another group of students comes into the lab. They're given the same test. They're told 50 cents per correct answer. And then here's the variation. They, at the end of the test, get to grade it themselves. They destroy all their materials, and they can just verbally report how they did. And so they know that whatever they say, they're going to get paid accordingly. Or in some versions, they write it down on a slip of paper and turn it in. And so in that kind of case, they have complete freedom to cheat if they want to. They don't have to. There's no one says you got to cheat. But they know that if they inflate their performance, they'll be paid more. Well, turns out they do. So in one of these studies, it was 7 out of 20 correct in the control condition where there's no opportunity to cheat. In the other group, where the materials were shredded, the shredder condition, 14 out of 20 correct in quotation marks, because I think it's clear that they didn't get all those answers correct. They're embellishing the results. Now, from this, you can, first of all, that's interesting in and of itself. That's an interesting result. It does not reflect well on people's honesty. But then from that basic setup, you can have all kinds of other wrinkles. You can do different variations of that further. You can have variations where you know that you share a birthday with someone else who you see cheating. You can have variations where you change the amount of money from 50 cents to a higher amount, or change the difficulty of the test, or lots of things. I'll give you one last variation, or that I'll expand on a little bit more, and then I'll stop answering. This is a particularly interesting one to me. So there's a variation where a third group comes in, they're given the test, 50 cents per correct answer. They're going to grade it themselves, shred their materials, so you expect cheating again. But in this case, the variation is that they first, before they take the test, they sign their university's honor code. So I know that's not familiar in all places, in all countries. From my experience, not everyone knows what an honor code is. So that means a code of ethics, which basically says, I pledge that I will not cheat on this test. So they read that, they sign it, then they take the test, they destroy the materials, they have every opportunity to cheat once again. And yet, in this situation, in the study that I'm familiar with, there was no cheating. At the group level, the group average, so maybe one or two individuals did cheat a little bit, but at the group level, the group performance on average was the same as the control level, all the way back down to the level where there was no opportunity to cheat. And so that's interesting and powerful too, which I interpret as a positive, a plus, alongside the negative of what happened in that group, which said 14 out of 20, even though they clearly did not get 14 out of 20.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say are your conclusions after all the literature you came across and you read and you evaluated when it comes to people's honesty in general? Would you say that it points to people, generally speaking, being honest or dishonest?
Yeah. So I would want to qualify it a great deal.
Okay.
I'll give you a conclusion. I'll not avoid the question, but I would want to have some, I should be honest, intellectually honest, and not overstate things or embellish things more than the evidence warrants, I think.
Okay.
So first of all, the evidence, as I said, is limited. Some areas it's better than others. Cheating, it's better than, say, the literature on stealing. We also want to keep in mind that these are Western participants mostly. So it's hard to generalize across the board. Also, there's a little heavier emphasis on students as opposed to the rest of the population. So also, one more caveat that's very important, there's a replication crisis going on in psychology, mm-hmm. where many studies that were, heralded as groundbreaking and ended up influencing government policy and changing people's lives, or were supposed to change people's lives, ended up not replicating and are now considered failures. So we would want to make sure that these cheating studies replicate and not just are one-offs. Having said all that, tentatively, my conclusion is most Westerners, at least, are not living up to the standards of honesty. So there's good preliminary reason to think that most of us are not honest people. So let's unpack that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. That could mean that most of us are dishonest. That's one option. I don't think that's true either. I think most of us are in a middle space or have a mixed character, something we talked about in our last podcast interview, our last discussion several years ago. A character that's a mixed bag of good and bad. So in some ways we are kind of conforming to the standards of honesty. In some ways we're conforming to the standards of dishonesty, but at the same time in our character. So now a couple more points about that. First of all, it's most people. So I think there's a kind of bell curve or distribution here. I do think that there are some outliers on both ends. So there's going to be some honest people, thank goodness. And we have, some heroes in the past, which we hold up for their honesty. In America, Abraham Lincoln is one of the people celebrated for honesty. And of course, we have people on the other side notable famous people and also some other maybe people down the road we who are not famous, who I would say are genuinely dishonest. Some familiar examples are people like Bernie Madoff, who had a Ponzi scheme that got a lot of attention as a form of financial dishonesty. But most of us are neither in neither of those categories. We're in the middle. Now, last point. Why do I think that? Why not just say most of us are dishonest? Well, I think it's because of studies like the one I just mentioned. Not the only studies. I mean, there are other ones like that. This is not the only study, but it's a representative example. So in the study I just mentioned, people did not cheat when they had the opportunity to after they had signed their honor code. Mm-hmm. I would not expect that of a dishonest person. I would expect a genuinely dishonest person to sign the honor code as a formality, as just a show, but not care about it, take the test, and then cheat. So they get the best of both worlds. They get to look like they're honest because they signed the honor code, and they get the money that they acquire from cheating. But that's not what happened. The group average was very low, and even when people tend to cheat, they don't cheat to the maximum amount. Mm-hmm. So very rarely in these studies do people say 20 out of 20. I got 20 out of 20 right, or 19 out of 20, or 18 out of 20. So those are some positive signs, some hopeful signs to me, where it's not just a matter of, oh, we are rampant cheaters. We want to cheat whenever we get the opportunity and not get caught, and we can think we benefit ourselves, and that's the end of the story. Because if that was the story, we would be dishonest people. But it's a more complicated story. It's a more nuanced story, and it has some hopeful aspects to it.
And do you have any idea why that's the case? I mean, could it be just because people are afraid of receiving some social condemnation or something like that? Or is it just some dispositional factors? Do you have any idea about that?
Of why, like, for example, in the honor code, people don't cheat. Yeah, there are some explanations here. So it wouldn't just be a matter of social approval in that study, because you get the social approval for signing the honor code, but then if you want to cheat, you can do it without anyone knowing. I mean, no one's going to find out. You would not get any social blame or punishment or disapprobation or anything like that. So you could have the best of both worlds. You could have the social approval and the cheating too, but people didn't go for the cheating. I think a different story goes something like this. What is the honor code doing? It's serving as a moral reminder. Mm-hmm. It's reminding us of values we actually hold to begin with. And this is, again, a more positive spin on it. So I think most of us do genuinely believe that cheating is wrong, stealing is wrong, in most cases at least, lying is wrong, but we don't always pay attention to that. We get distracted. We also get tempted by things that benefit us. And an honor code can function to reset our priorities, can get our attention back to where it needs to be so that we're reminded of our values, that we do genuinely believe that cheating is wrong. Furthermore, and this is not unique to me, this is part of the psychology literature explaining these results, we also want to think of ourselves as honest people. So we don't just care what other people think of us, we also care how we think of ourselves. And we want to think of ourselves as good people. We want to think of ourselves as virtuous, as specifically honest. Mm-hmm. So how does that matter here? It's very hard to be reminded of your values by the honor code, reminded of how it's important to not cheat, and then turn around and cheat and think of yourself as an honest person. It's very hard to pull that off. It's very hard to have that fresh in your mind, want to think of yourself as an honest person, and at the same time, engage in rampant cheating. So your values plus your desire to think of yourself as an honest person can hold you back and prevent you, or anyone, I'm not talking about you specifically, anyone, from cheating as much as you might be able to get away with. So
Yeah. So one last question, and still within the realm of psychology, not so much philosophy, but from those studies, do you know of any specific environmental factors that promote or facilitate dishonest behavior? And associated with that, are there any interventions out there to improve honesty?
hmm yeah, so big question here. So there are environmental factors that seem to enhance or go the other direction, inhibit honesty, sway people in different ways towards honesty or dishonesty. And that's going to be connected to the discussion of interventions and enhancements. So let me take them in two stages. The environmental factors that have been studied in these different situations, different studies, range from across the board, all kinds of things. They can include things like noise and smell. They can include whether you're wearing cheap, fake sunglasses or genuine sunglasses. They can include things like whether other people in the environment are cheating. You notice other people cheating or not. They can include whether there's a mirror in the environment or not. So let me expand on that a little bit more. People who do a task where there's an opportunity to cheat and there's no mirror tend to cheat. People who do the same task but are placed in front of a mirror tend to not cheat. So that's an example of a subtle environmental manipulation that can have significant impacts on behavior. Now, why that one's, I just can't let that one go. I've got to say a little bit more about that. So why does the mirror have an impact? Well, it connects to the previous question and our self-image. If we look at the mirror, it's hard to think of ourselves as honest people if we're also cheating at the same time. So a mirror serves to have a window into how you are being seen by yourself and can serve to curb cheating. Okay, now on to interventions and enhancements and ways to make us better. And this is all, they're all connected. This is not a separate topic. It's all interrelated to each other. I'll highlight two things that I think, and there's many more things we could talk about, but of the many different strategies for growing in honesty and strategies for growing in character in general, I'll just focus on two in our remaining time. One is moral reminders, because this picks up so naturally with what we've just been talking about. So having a kind of environmental manipulation in the form of a moral reminder can be quite effective in getting people to behave more honestly. The honor code, as we said, is such a moral reminder. And at Wake Forest, my university, we have an honor code. We remind students often of the importance of the honor code. Every test that students take for me, they have to not only sign the honor code, but we say it out loud jointly. We verbally kind of utter the honor code together, showing our commitment to it. That's serving as a moral reminder. And we have other moral reminders in our lives, ranging from readings that we do, diaries, conversations. Other people can remind us of things you said you were going to do this. I'm reminding of you. You said you're going to keep your promise. I'm going to remind you of that. So that's one whole family of strategy. Well, it's one strategy. That could take lots of different forms. The last thing I'll end with is a rather different one, which we haven't touched on, but makes note of the point that there are outliers of honest people. Not the most of us, but there are ones who actually succeed in becoming honest. And that is looking at virtuous exemplars and role models. This is true for all virtues, but focusing on honesty, having people who have done better than us, who are further along the spectrum between honesty and dishonesty, seeing them, admiring them, and wanting to be more like them in our lives. Whether this are famous people like Abraham Lincoln, whether it's fictional people or real people, you can have works of literature can be powerful in this respect. Whether it's today a contemporary celebrity, unfortunately, it's hard to find many examples of that who are honest. Probably your best bet is people in your life, hopefully, I mean, I'm hoping this is the case, who you know at work or in your family or a neighbor or something like that, a close friends, whose honesty shines through and inspires you at not just an intellectual level, but at an emotional level to become more like them. Because emotional responses are super important and very powerful in fostering character change and growth. And so that you admire them in a way that leads to elevation, what psychologists call elevation or inspiration, become more like that person. That's the second strategy of using exemplars.
So just one more question now, and unrelated to these previous questions. So I would like to ask you, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a professional philosopher. I mean, what I know about philosophy comes from my readings and from these interviews I've been doing. But it seems to me that there's not lots of recent literature on virtues specifically. Is that right? And if so, would you have any explanation for that?
Yep. It depends. I'll give you the usual philosophy answer. It depends. In the history of ethics, virtue ethics as a theory, a way of doing ethics, a kind of approach that was dominant in ancient Greeks with Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. That approach was not popular up until about the last 50 years. And it's had a big resurgence, and it's got a lot of attention. That's virtue ethics in general. And discussions of virtue in general, there's been a lot of attention to that. Particular virtues, it's very hit and miss, though. That's what you're getting at. A few virtues have gotten some discussion. It's not necessarily ones you would predict. It seems to be somewhat random. Modesty, for example, and humility have gotten a lot of attention. Other ones have been almost completely neglected in philosophy. Now we're talking about, so in philosophical research. Honesty is one of them, which is what inspired me to work on it. One of the reasons why I wanted to work on it. In the last 50 years, there were only 2 articles written in philosophy on honesty. So stunning neglect. Another example, generosity. Almost nothing written on generosity. Another example, patience. Almost nothing written on patience. Why is that? It can't be a matter of the importance of the virtue, because these are clearly very important virtues. So it's not that. And at this point, we have to just speculate. I don't have a clear explanation. I don't think anyone has a clear explanation. One speculation is that maybe philosophers thought there weren't many interesting issues or puzzles that needed to be solved. Maybe they thought, honesty is pretty straightforward. What's there to talk about? Well, in my book, I've tried to show that there's a lot to talk about. It's actually very complicated and fascinating and rich and worth exploring. Maybe it was that people just weren't paying attention to particular virtues to begin with. They just weren't interested in that project of unpacking a particular virtue. Maybe they were just more interested in virtue in general. I don't know. But what happened in the case of humility and modesty was that one philosopher came along, wrote one paper, and this was the philosopher Julia Driver, wrote one paper on that topic and proposed a very controversial view, a view that many people thought that can't be right. It just seems crazy. And so that led lots of other people to want to write papers showing why Driver's view was wrong and why she missed the boat, and here's a better view. And then someone else would say, no, that's not the right view either, and here's a better view. And I noticed, no, that's not the right view either, here's another view. And it starts, building and building and building. So what it often takes is just one person to come along, put out a view, not on purpose make it controversial, but people find it controversial, they find it interesting, they think they've got a better view, and then they publish something trying to say why they've got a better view. So I'm hoping to do that with honesty. I'm hoping that I know I've got a view out there now. We've talked about it for the last hour. It's probably wrong. It's probably got a lot of problems with it, but that's okay if it inspires others to come along and show why my view is wrong and make progress in discovering the truth and getting a better view out there and getting more people to talk about it. So much the better.
Great. And so the book is again Honesty, the Philosophy and Psychology of a Neglected Virtue. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. Miller, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Sure. So I have a website, christianbmiller.com. That's one word, Christian B. Miller. It's also just frankly easiest to Google my name and philosophy or Google my name and Wake Forest. But you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. I'm at Character Gap. One word, Character Gap. And that's easy to find me there too.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. This is our second talk and it's always been fascinating. And thank you so much for writing and sending me the book because it's been a great read.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be back and hopefully there'll be other opportunities in the future.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this episode until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, starting at $1 per month. You also have links to PayPal. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Dennis Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf, Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguenzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugnig, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Weira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, and Sonny Smith. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Van Agdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivat. Thank you for all.